Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting virtual tour with Pretty Gritty Tours. I'm your guide this evening, Chris, and we are embarking on a journey through Washington State. I don't think it's a secret at this point, my deep adoration for the state of Washington and everything that it's got going on here. But I think sometimes people misinterpret the state and they forget just how much cool stuff is here. And that's why we're going over Washington State's volcanoes tonight. Washington State is, bisected by the Cascade Range, and there are over 10 volcanoes in the state, most of them dormant or extinct, but there are 5 active volcanoes. And actually, if you look at the list of the 18 most dangerous volcanoes in the world, all 5 of our active volcanoes make the top 18. So very proud, source of pride for the state of Washington. But yeah, it can give you pause, wondering what's going to happen out there. So tonight we're just going to explore that. If you have questions along the way, please let me know. It's good to see you all here. I'm glad that everybody's tuning in, and I'm always happy to join in the conversation as we go. But there's a lot to cover, and we're gonna do what we can. So for my uninitiated, we'll start with some basics. What is a volcano? Because there could be some broad discussion on this, but for tonight, we're talking about a vent or chimney which transfers molten rock from the Earth's core out. And like I said, there's quite a lot of these. Like if you're looking at the Cascade Range, right? All of our mountains are the product of seismic and volcanic activity. And of those peaks, 5 are active. But the Cascade Range runs quite a ways, through British Columbia, then down through California. And when you're looking at it here, right, you can see the different zones all throughout here. So this is a colored map of the Cascade Range that extends from southern Canada down into Northern California and all the peaks along the way there. And of the peaks that are volcanic in Washington State, you can get viewpoints where the majority of them are all together. So this right here is looking south down along the Cascade Range with an aerial shot. And from left to right, we've got Mount Adams, Mount Hood, which is down in Oregon, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens. And each of these is a volcano. So yeah, this is a good question. Is there any chance of something like Mount Si blowing? No, there's not, which, good stuff to know. Here's the bad news though. Of the 5 active volcanoes in Washington State, if any of them were to blow, it would be devastating, and possibly not for the reasons that you think. Tonight, we're going to kind of talk about, too, what makes each of these volcanoes dangerous, some more dangerous than others, and then which of these 5 is, hands down, the most dangerous. And I've got 2 answers for that. So you get to decide for yourself, I guess. But what makes us special? We're all part of the Ring of Fire here. So the Pacific Ring of Fire, as I'm sure you've heard of, is this belt that circumnavigates the Pacific Rim, and there are volcanoes all along this, and it's because of these plates, tectonic plates that are coming together at various points here. And when one plate goes under and one rises up, and this, especially on like the Pacific Rim, right, where it's not just that you have crunching of tectonic plates coming together and pulverizing and liquefying all this rock, but you get the injection of seawater at the same time. So not only are you crushing something with enough force to turn solid rock into a liquid, but when you inject that water into it, it superheats it into steam and shoots it throughout various vents, chambers, and portals, and you get a really caustic area. And hey, what do you know? We're all on top of one right now. So the majority of our volcanoes out here in the Cascade Range, within 70 miles for the most part of Tacoma, Seattle, are stratovolcanoes, which essentially is a volcano that builds itself up over time like the American dream, through a period of death, rebirth, and regeneration. Each time it sends out a little more magma, lava, ash, crushed stone. It builds on its previous failures, eventually creating a tall, slender cone, pleasing to look at, which is basically the story of all of us here in the Pacific Northwest. And you can quote me on that for as long as you want. And here's kind of a nicer illustration of what is going on the Pacific Rim here on that ring of fire. And you can see that there are plates that are being subducted going underneath another plate. And in that crunch zone, you get not only mountain ranges, but the injection of that hot magma in there creates these volcanoes that we have. That's a very good question. Some are dormant and some are active. And of the volcanoes throughout the area here, there are, like I said, just over 10 in Washington state. Only 5 are, well, you can call them active. And how do you determine if a volcano is active? Here's the official statement on that. It has to have had volcanic activity, I believe, in the last 10,000 years. So even if a volcano hasn't erupted in, 9,500 years, we have no evidence, geological or otherwise, of any sort of eruption going on, it can still be considered an active volcano, even if it's in a dormant phase. I think is the quick answer to that. So here's a rundown on the volcanoes that are widely recognized throughout the state of Washington. These are the top 10. You can see that some, like Goat Rocks, Signal Peak, and Simcoe, are considered extinct. And like I was saying, to become an extinct volcano, you have to have gone greater than 10,000 years without volcanic activity. And when you're looking at the lifespan of these volcanoes, 10,000 years is not much. So it's still a short period of time, but it's long enough that they're like, this has moved past its point of being considered a viable volcano. The other thing I like to point out with this one too is you can see how tall the majority these are. The top 6 are over 6,000 feet tall, with, of course, Mount Rainier being not only our tallest volcano, but also our tallest mountain, not just in Washington state, but in the Cascade Range across the board. The crown jewel, the peak achievement is right here in Washington state. And we're very lucky to have her here. And yeah, so if you're over in Eastern Washington, they have this trendy little sign. So you can see from this viewpoint 4 of those big volcanoes, with, of course, Mount Hood thrown into the mix there, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and then Mount Rainier. And when you're looking at Washington's 5 active volcanoes, these are them. So if you go to the Department of Natural Resources, dnr.wa.gov, they have an amazing rundown on the 5 active volcanoes of Washington state. And it comes with a bunch of information, not only these sweet postcard graphics, but also where are the danger zones, things that you can do to prepare. Are you close to a volcano? Are you in the path of destruction? What to know? And that's kind of what we're looking at tonight too, is I want to introduce you to our 5 ladies here, our 5 active volcanoes in Washington, and kind of help you understand what makes each of them dangerous, because each of the 5 of them has not only its own personality, but the own part of their lifespan that makes them more or less dangerous than the other ones. So if you're looking at the map of Washington state, starting north, moving south, we've got Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams. And on a good day from Tacoma, you can see Mount Rainier, obviously, but from at least 3 breweries in town that I know of, you can definitely see Glacier Peak as well. So we're situated in a nice spot to see them. And when you're looking at their activity, I think here's a kind of helpful chart. So this is looking at the last 4,000 years of volcanic activity for these particular peaks here in Washington. And you can see that Mount Rainier has a significant amount of activity, including eruptions. But Mount St. Helens, hands down, is the most active volcano in Washington state. And here's another little rundown when you're looking at where they are on the Cascade Range there. So this is all of the Cascade Range volcanoes and their periods of activity. And of them all, our girl, Mount St. Helens, is still the most active. So not just for Washington state, but for all of the Cascade Range, our very own St. Helens. And in fact, if you look at the 5 most dangerous volcanoes in the United States, the majority of them are on our Cascade Range, but also Washington state. So Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, both make the list there. And Three Sisters is just south of here in Oregon. And then, of course, Augustine is up in Alaska, and Kilauea, which I think really, if we're talking like iconic volcanic activity, people think of Kilauea the most because it is aggressive and fire laden. And that's not something that you see as often with Washington volcanoes. It's not the same sort of imagery that you would expect from a Hawaii volcano. And the big portion of that is because our mountains are covered in a lot of snow and ice and glacier, and then pumice buildup as well there. So that's actually part of what makes our volcanoes more dangerous. And I think obviously the most iconic example of that is Mount St. Helens. In case you were around on May 18th, Sunday morning, 1980, you were a part of the IT crowd that got to see the spectacular eruption of Mount St. Helens. And I remember my dad telling me that he was there. He was attending Pacific Lutheran University when it happened. And he thought that we had been bombed by the Russians. Like, it was peak Cold War era. And he just saw that like ash cloud extending up into the sky. And it never even occurred to a lot of people at the time that it would be the mountain, even though there were a lot of precursors that it was going to happen, but it wasn't iconic the way that it is today, right? If someone were to say, oh, the mountain's going to go, it would have, I hope, a different reaction than it did back in 1980. And so first there was an earthquake that dislodged a portion of Mount St. Helens, and that triggered a landslide, which then sent itself into a blast, and that shot up a tower of ash and steam 30,000 feet up into the air. And the resulting blast knocked down trees for miles. And it destroyed homes, businesses, a lot of stuff in that blast radius around the mountain itself, leveling huge swaths of forest instantaneously, and then leaving this sort of barren scape. But I do think it's interesting to mention that it happened in May. Geologists weren't able to actually get into the area until June of that same year, 1980. And they were shocked to see this. This is fireweed. And they assumed that it would just be sterilized, like an atomic bomb going off, essentially, right? But they found that in that like 2-month period from initial blast to when they got out there, they found wildlife out there, a series of gophers, high majority of birds, mammals returning to the area. They were able to spot fish in the area as well. And then a resurgence of the fireweed was the first sort of plant to start coming back before a greater reforestation of the area took place there. And yeah, this is a great question. So if a volcano is dormant, it just means that it's sleepy. If it's extinct, it means that it's dead. So a volcano can be dormant, and it can be dormant for a very long period of time. There's sort of guesswork that goes into knowing when a volcano is going to come back alive or have an eruption. And it's not an exact science, but they do have markers. So when geologists are looking at the activity of a volcano, they look at the seismic activity. They look at all the different ways that you can measure like dome growth, if there is any sort of seismic activity in one spot as opposed to the other. And then they measure those over a series of time, and they can notice when a volcano is acting irregularly, and then start to base that on other volcanoes that have been observed and say, all right, we're going to have a problem here soon or not. And that's exactly what happened with Mount St. Helens. They knew that there was something happening, and they went in to warn people. So this is from a hand-colored print from 1914 by Kisser Photo Company, and it shows Mount St. Helens pre-eruption, obviously, and you can see she had a much taller peak. And as this seismic activity was going on, they were like, hey, we got to get out of here. And I think perhaps no one was the poster child more of denying that message than this gentleman right here. If you don't know, this is Harry R. Truman. He was the owner-operator of Spirit Lake Lodge, which was just north of Mount St. Helens. And for just over 50 years, he was the iconic figure of Spirit Lake Lodge. He was kind of the mascot of Mount St. Helens. And when people were like, hey, the mountain's going to blow, he was in denial about that, or had made his peace with it and decided to stay behind. And his lodge was part of the area that was destroyed in that blast radius. And I believe, I got to remember my figure here, but it was something along the lines of when Mount St. Helens erupted after the initial earthquake and landslide, that blast had something like 8 times the power and force of every explosive used in both World War I and World War II, including both of the atomic bombs. It was 8 times more powerful than all of those explosives through the 2 world wars all at once. And it was devastating. It completely destroyed the entire landscape all throughout that area there. And I've got a quick news clip about Mr. Truman.
It is probable tonight Spirit Lake is no more. That's the word from the Forest Service. Survey crews say huge pyroclastic flows of hot ash, rock, and gas have enveloped the lake, turning it into a bubbling cauldron of hot debris. We have reports that Spirit Lake Lodge is totally wiped out. Those reports are unconfirmed. As for lodge operator, 84-year-old Harry Truman, we can only surmise he has realized his wish to go down with the ship. We understand the area is completely buried beneath 30 feet of mud. I last saw Harry about 2 weeks ago. It was one of many afternoons we'd spent together over the past year, and so I came to know Harry through his salty tales of days gone by, tales of running whiskey, and of the day he settled down. Harry, together with his wife, refused for nearly half a century to be defeated by the elements. Their home was destroyed several times by high winds and fire. Each time they built it back again. But Harry's wife died 5 years ago, and it was because the two had spent their married life and the last days of her life together on the mountain that Harry refused to leave. It was for the love of his wife that Harry spit in the mountain's eye.
No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. If I left, it'd kill me. If I left this place and lost my home, I'd die in a week. I couldn't live. I couldn't extend it. So I'm like that old captain. By God, I'm going down the ship. I said, if the damn thing takes this mountain, I'm going along with it. I'd rather be dead than to live without it. That's crazy. Damn stupid. Okay. The people see that, they say the craziest man in God's real old Truman.
That's Harry Truman in a nutshell, my friends. And you can take whatever you want out of it, but I personally think he made the right decision right there. Remaining on the mountain. I've got a lot of good questions here about what would we look like if one of these volcanoes erupts, right? And this was what they learned from Mount St. Helens, is that it's not just the explosive blast of the volcano itself, but that the chain reactions from that have devastating consequences. So obviously that plume of ash darkened the sky and it went at some points all the way around the world. St. Helens ash can be found all throughout Washington state and the Pacific Northwest in general. But it was the lahars, or the mudslides, that were the most devastating. And what happens is, you can see here, when the top of that mountain exploded and that heat and steam and magma was instantly released, it turned the ice and debris to steam and then water, and that liquefies the mud and the rocks. And when you lose that much space and it becomes liquid, it runs down the side of the mountain really, really dangerously, right? And so here's an example. This was a bridge that was completely destroyed in a matter of minutes from the lahar, from that sludge of water and mud and debris. And to show you here, so this is that meltwater lahar from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and you can see how it runs down there and snakes out. And to show you just how dangerous it is, right? Imagine in a matter of minutes that there is an explosion, and while you're looking up at the ash cloud, a steaming river of mud and ash and broken trees barrels, like 60, 70 miles an hour down through the flood valleys towards you. And it can carry with it things like this rock. This was one of the landslide lahars that came off of Mount St. Helens. And you can see for perspective here, the gentleman standing to this rock that was racing like a car down the freeway down the mountain after the explosion. So it's not just the blast, right? You have your blast radius here, which destroyed all these trees, a majority of which were actually used for the timber for the Tacoma Dome. Fun fact. But then you have to also worry about the pyroclastic flow, that secondary explosion. You have to worry about the lahar, the liquefied ice and rock and mud landslide. You have to worry about the earthquake. Then there's the eruption cloud and eruption column, and then the ash falling, which can create acidic rain. There are various stages to the volcanic eruption, starting with the earthquake, moving to the explosive blast, then having the fallout almost instantaneously of that glacier, an entire glacier liquefied in an instant, uprooting half the mountain with it and then sluicing it down the side of a mountain at record pace. And then you have to worry about ash and acid rain for a period of time. So really, it's not a pleasant experience. I wouldn't recommend it. So what can you do to be aware? Let's get to know our volcanoes tonight. So we're talking about Mount Baker, Glacier Peak, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Adams. And you can find a majority of information about how to be ready for this on the USGS site here, or for the Department of Natural Resources. Both have really good information about volcanoes. But you got to get to know the United States Geological Survey Group. They were created in 1879, I believe, by an act of Congress, and their job is to be the silent watchers. They have instrumentation cameras all throughout the United States, and especially here because they watch. They listen to the wind, they listen to the earth, and they measure and record, and they are the ever-present watchful eye trying to figure out if one of these volcanoes is going to go again. And they've marked them on their handy-dandy map here, by their danger level, essentially. So when you're looking at all of the volcanoes in the area here on their map, you can see we've got our 5 active ones up here in Washington State, starting up at the top there, moving our way down. And those green ones are considered dangerous, that they have the possibility of eruption. The most iconic is going to be Mount Rainier, right? 14,411 feet, depending when you measure it. Also known as Mount Tacoma, Mount Tahoma. It is an active stratovolcano right here in Washington State, and there are very few cities on the west side of the state that don't have, on a clear day, a view of this iconic mountain volcano. She's located right here in the heart of Mount Rainier National Forest and is massive, right? So she's 60 miles as the crow flies away from Seattle, the biggest city in the area there. The last eruption, there was possibly a minor eruption in 1894. That's the last time they have it recorded. The last major eruption that they can measure was 1,000 years ago, and she's considered a danger level very high. And the majority of that's because of this. There are so many glaciers on top of Mount Rainier, and no matter what happens, right? So let's say Mount Rainier has some similar situation to Mount St. Helens, where there's an earthquake that triggers a landslide. Part of that cone comes off the top, and that triggers a blast. Devastating. But even just a small vent opening up and then causing a rapid melting of a glacier, which creates instantaneous devastating erosion, right? Would have its effects. So here is the Lahar map, right? So when you're looking at a possible explosion of Mount Rainier, you've got that sort of pink, the salmon colored up there. That's the blast radius of the mountain. And then you've got your orange and yellow here, which go down essentially river floodplains. And it shows if one part of the mountain has that Lahar happen, it can go all the way up into Puyallup, Tacoma, down through the tide flats into Commencement Bay. And it would be a raging tsunami of rock and mud and destruction. And Rainier is listed as one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world currently, not to freak anybody out, but there's the Decade Geological Research Initiative, which stands for Deep Earth Carbon Degassing Project. And decade volcanoes are considered the most active and dangerous volcanoes worldwide. You can see they're all sort of in a middle zone here. And Mount Vesuvius is on that list. There are quite a few down in sort of the Central American section there. And then Rainier makes the list up here. And it's just because of the insane amount of material. If anything happens to Mount Rainier, so much material would be instantaneously removed from the mountain, turned into a liquid, sluicing off other material and rocks as big as houses and sending them from 14,000 feet down into the flood valleys. And the other thing that gets a volcano onto the decade list is its proximity to civilization, right? So Mount Rainier is a heavily populated area by comparison to a lot of other volcanoes. And so it has the potential, especially when you look at our danger map here, right? How many, not just like homes and everything, but entire cities are in the destruction path there. So when you're looking at Mount Rainier, she is on the list, but here's the good news. She makes the active list of volcanoes because the last one that we know about was probably 1894, confirmed in the last 1,000 years. That means that there is likely a longer period of time before there would be a large eruption. So for the lifetime of people assembled right now on our virtual tour, we have, knock wood, not as much to worry about. But when you look at, like, from Seattle, this mountain, and know that it is a sleeping dragon that at any moment could get hungry and wake up, there can be some notable apprehension about it. Rainier makes my list as the most dangerous because if there is an eruption, it would be devastating in ways that we can't even necessarily imagine. The one to watch, though, is actually still Mount St. Helens. And Mount St. Helens currently has an elevation of 8,363 feet, and that is ever changing since the mountain was born, really. To give you some comparison, right? When you're looking at the age of mountains, you got to go hundreds of thousands of years sometimes. It's estimated that Mount St. Helens is only about 3,500 years old. And she continues to build herself up, have an eruption, sink down, build herself back up, so on and so forth. And we actually have a really cool time lapse just of the dome, right? So this is of the peak of Mount St. Helens going through that cycle of building and on and in the very recent past. So this is just from 2004 to 2008. The USGS has been surveying, as the name says, the mountain over time. And so as that steam vent opens up, more of this ash and rock and molten material gets pressed out of the crater and has created essentially a new mountain peak here right now. And like I said, this is over a very relatively short period of time that you can see the volcano growing again. And when you look back at that chart of volcanoes in the Cascade Range, Mount St. Helens continues to be the most active. So while she has already experienced an incredible eruption in our lifetime, just 1980, the probability of another eruption occurring is still highly likely. And they've been able to predict it in the past. There's a very high likelihood that they'll be able to predict it again, and there will be advanced warning for everyone. But if you look at the map here, this is the interesting part. So here's where Mount St. Helens is, right down there, parallel to Castle Rock, Longview, just on the other side of the Yakima Indian Reservation. And this is our map. So when you're looking at the blast radius, right, there's a near volcano area that encompasses quite a bit of space, but the lahars are not nearly as expansive or terrifying as if Mount Rainier exploded. So while there's a higher likelihood that Mount St. Helens could erupt in the near future, if Mount Rainier goes, it's going to be a much bigger blast. And a big portion of that is that Mount St. Helens has already exhausted a lot of the material that was on top of her in that period there. And so you can see this is the crater. And this, I think, was taken in 2004 with satellite imagery. And so you can see there's not as much potential destruction in there right now. One of the volcanoes that I think people just forget about, don't talk about so much, probably because it's so far north, is Mount Baker. And it's an active glaciated stratovolcano for my people who are interested in the wordsmithery of it. This is up in the North Cascades, just south of the Canadian border. It's approximately 50 miles east of Bellingham, if that helps with your understanding of where it is. I've got the map for you right here. So that's about 130 miles as the crow flies down to Seattle. And the last eruption recorded was in 1880. 8 years before Washington gets statehood. There are indicators to suggest that in 1843, there was a major or a moderate eruption. I guess the last major eruption would have been 6,700 years ago. So you can take that a couple ways. Either that Baker's getting close to extinction. You know, you got to hit that 10,000 year mark. But there is still activity here. So while there hasn't been a major eruption in a long period of time, it's likely that there won't be another major eruption anytime soon. But a minor eruption could still have a significant amount of damage associated with it. And you're looking at why. Any amount of steam exploding out of the Earth's heart is going to liquefy rapidly that snow and glacier that's up on the top there. And then you can see the massive lahar zones here. And these are options. It's not necessarily that it would go both ways, but these are the most probable routes based on the survey group on where it would go down. And as you can see, they follow rivers and lakes and areas where, of course, water would naturally flow. Baker, you know, is massive, right? It's 10,700 feet, not as tall as Rainier, but you can't scoff at a 10.7 thousand foot mountain. And you can see over the years that there will sometimes be a little bit of activity that comes out here. Baker, it's not going into my immediate threat list, even though it is officially listed as a dangerous volcano. So if you're in the area out there, yeah, you gotta be careful here. Ooh, this is a great question. Which eruption would be deadlier, Yellowstone or all of Washington's active dormant volcanoes? I'm gonna base this just on what I know. But the Yellowstone supervolcano is supposed to be listed as one of the most cataclysmic events ever, right? So if that volcano under the park goes, it would have long-reaching effects over a long period of time, right? Just based on the amount of material that it would eject into the atmosphere alone, you would have fallout from this volcano for ages. It could alter the climate irreparably. That said, If all of Washington State's volcanoes were to go off simultaneously, I think you might get a comparable amount of material jettisoned into the air, but certainly the urban areas around those volcanoes are significantly more than Yellowstone in its entirety, right? So I think the loss of life in the immediate eruption would be much higher. I would think the lingering effects of the Yellowstone volcano would be more. But if anybody has no more information on that, if I have a volcanologist present on the tour tonight, please feel free to let me know if I'm wrong on this, because I'm curious too now. Another one of our volcanoes is Glacier Peak, coming in just about 200 feet shorter than Mount Baker. Glacier Peak is a feisty one. This is known as Dachobed, which is a Lushootseed word, and it is one of the most active volcanoes here. Nothing comparable to St. Helens, but definitely has a lot of grumbles down below. And this one is interesting because Glacier Peak is actually the most isolated of the 5 active volcanoes out here. It's out in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, right? It's definitely visible from both Seattle and Tacoma, and is kind of just up over the eastern suburbs of Vancouver. You can see it from those suburbs of Vancouver. It's a peak. 70 miles away from Seattle, and the last eruption that they can look at information geologically and assess, they think was about 1700. But the danger level is listed as very high, and it's because of glacier. Once again, right? The level of glaciers and zones that would be affected is incredibly high for Glacier Peak, as the name implies, right? So about 13,000 years ago, Glacier Peak produced one of Washington's largest eruptions, with an ashfall way more voluminous than Mount St. Helens, and was perhaps the largest volcanic eruption that they can detect throughout all of Washington's history. This little cutie right here is our spunky number 3. While you're looking at Mount Rainier for actual just scope of devastation, Mount St. Helens is the most likely to get into a fight at this point. Glacier Peak comes in at number 3 because it is often neglected. It's not considered, but the amount of activity going on with it is still very high. I want to see if I can bring up, I think I put it in the wrong spot, but if you look at the activity of the volcanoes in the area again here, let's see if I can, here we go. So you can see Glacier Peak spaces it out more, right? So Mount St. Helens has had very consistent activity over the last 4,000 years. Boom, 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 boom. Mount Rainier was very active and then has sort of spaced out her activity. But Glacier Peak likes to put it together in duos. And if you can see, what was it, like 1700 might have been the last one. We're almost due at this point for some Glacier Peak activity. And because of the amount of debris and just shrapnel that's associated with this particular peak out there, it would have a pretty big effect. And so where's my Glacier Peak one here again, just to show you the fallout range here. So yeah, this is Glacier Peak, where it has the potential to run with its lahars, and this is its proximity to a lot of those urban centers out there. So it has the potential to be a big event. Which brings me to Mount Adams. So Mount Adams is 12,281 feet high. It is just down here in southern Washington, on the other side of Mount St. Helens, south of Mount Rainier. You have a really good view of it from like the Yakima area out there in eastern Washington. And it is a potentially active stratovolcano. Excuse me. And so although Adams has erupted very significantly throughout the past, it hasn't erupted in the last 1,000 years that we can tell. It's not considered extinct, but as the second highest mountain in Washington, just after Mount Rainier, it has the potential again for a significant amount of devastation. So this one is actually more about the blast radius and what could come off of the mountain, as opposed to the glacial melt of lahars. And so when you're looking at Mount Adams, right, it's got such a narrow and aggressive peak that if there were to be some sort of explosion there, it could send out a significant amount of material just from the blast alone. And it's listed lower down right there. It's not extinct, right? It's still an active volcano, but it's been a very long time. And based on all the markers that they've looked at for it, it's very unlikely that Adams is going to have an eruption anytime here in the near future. That's not to say that it's impossible, but if you're gonna make your bets on it, you don't have to worry as much about Adams. Now, if you're curious here about like if you want to collect them all and learn a little bit more about what you can do for your volcano prep to see if you're in the immediate danger zone or if there's something that you should be worried about, you can go to departmentofnaturalresources.wa.gov. That's dnr.wa.gov. They have these very classy little pamphlets on each of the 5 active volcanoes in Washington state and, you know, how to be ready for it, things that you should be preparing in your household, evacuation routes, just what to know in case the call comes through. And they do a really good job of observing in the area. So that's their job, right? They're the U.S. Geological Survey Group. They go out and they watch, and they've got cameras on everything and seismographic instrumentation in the ground at all times. And they're just constantly monitoring the health and happiness of our volcanoes in Washington and making plans in case there's an issue. So the emergency response system in Washington state has been prepped to warn people instantaneously if they think that there's going to be an eruption imminent. Also, there would be advance announcements sent out so that you don't just have like, oh, I have 20 minutes to figure out my life and get out of here. But it's something that I think everybody who lives in Washington state should know more about, because when you look at the map, right, like they're prominent. They're right in the middle of the state. It's our Cascade Range. I'm trying to bring up my good one here. Yeah. So these are our big 5, and they really cover an enormous section of the state. At any given point, the vast majority of Washington's population is right in the lahar zone of these 5 active volcanoes. So it's definitely worth knowing that they're out there. That said, don't panic too much. Each of these 5 volcanoes makes an excellent adventure opportunity. They've all been well maintained by the State Park Service and National Park Service, as is the case with Mount Rainier. And you can go out and explore these places. And in fact, I highly encourage it, because each of them is a volcano. And if you've seen those pictures of Mount St. Helens, right, a lot can change in a single eruption. So if you want to go and explore some peaks, now might be the chance to do it, because you just never know. And honestly, look at the last few years of this world. You never really know what's going to happen. So you should probably use this opportunity to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you've enjoyed your virtual experiences, we've got a lot of good stuff coming up. I know our next one is about the Maury Island incident, the first time that the Men in Black were ever referenced, and the first official death of anyone in the U.S. Air Force. What bold claims, Chris, and yet I'm willing to back them up. Next week, I think it's coming up. I'll have to actually check. I should know what's going on. We also have some great information coming up about food tours in Tacoma and racing, the history of racing in Tacoma, as well as the history of McNeil Island, its lifetime as a prison out there, and the final resting place of the people that were buried in the cemetery out of McNeil. We'll all be covering very soon in new virtual experiences. So if you've enjoyed it, you can always tip your guide right on the homepage of prettygrittytours.com or using the handy QR code here. But thank you guys for joining me tonight. I hope you get out there, see some great sights, always keep on exploring, and let me know if you have anything else that you want to see, because I'm around and I'm always out there investigating. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you soon.